Hey there! In this video, I'm going to be taking a deep dive into the raw capabilities of the Nikon Z6 Mark III. And before I get into it, I just have to have a huge thank you to B&H Photo, who lent me the Nikon Z6 III to test out, review, and make videos like this for all of you. If you're looking to pick up some camera gear, please go check out B&H. It's where I buy most of my stuff from. There are links in the description for the Z6 III and all the gear that I use on a regular basis. And I seriously cannot thank B&H enough for making videos like this possible. Okay, at the time of recording this, I just want to mention that I am using version 1.00 firmware on the Z6 Mark III. I don't think there's even been a firmware update on it because this camera hasn't even been out that long. Now, like I said, this is going to be a deep dive with a lot of test charts. So this will get pretty nerdy and I hope you're up for that. But I'll first explain the raw options in the Z6 Mark III and how to use them. I did find some interesting things, which I will get into later on this video. Now, to start off with, there are actually two different RAW options that you can record internally in the Z6 Mark III. You can record NRAW, which is Nikon's RAW format, and you can also record ProRes RAW. Now, both of these, like I said, you can record them internally, and both of them are 12-bit. I'm going to be focusing on NRAW throughout this video because I edit in Davinci Resolve. If you edit in Final Cut Pro, I would recommend shooting in ProRes RAW. I also want to say that all of the formats in the Z6 III are in a 16:9 aspect ratio. There are no DCI or 17:9 options, and there is no open gate recording options in the Z6 Mark III. So inside the camera, I want to show the different options that you have for shooting RAW. So under the video recording menu, if you go to the video file type, there are a few different options here. First of which is NRAW. This is the one we'll be talking about most of today. We have the ProRes RAW HQ, which I also mentioned. We have a ProRes 422 HQ. This is a 10-bit 422 codec. And then lastly, we have the H.265 10-bit, and there's also an 8-bit, but I don't think most of us are interested in shooting that. I do want to mention that the H.265 is 10-bit, but it's only a 420 codec. I know there's been some misunderstanding about this, but in all of the newer Nikon cameras, the H.265 10-bit is 420. If you are looking for a compressed codec that is 422, you have to use the ProRes 422 HQ. So that is your option for compressed codec for 422. Now, there are two options for NRAW. We have NLOG and SDR. So what I recommend is that you stick to NLOG, and I will show you later on the computer that it doesn't really matter what you set it to in the camera, that it's really just metadata, but it's best to let it set up as NLOG because that's what we'll be using to grade when you get into the computer. I also want to mention how to properly expose NRAW because some of this is a little bit tricky to find out. And since we'll be shooting in NRAW in NLOG, you need to expose it how you would expose NLOG. So in a controlled lighting situation, you want to use your zebras and a gray card and set your pattern tone range to midtones, and you want to set your midtone range to 95 plus or minus 5 and use those zebras on a gray card. I've talked about this in several videos before. I got this information directly from Nikon. If you'd like to see how to expose NLOG in lots of other situations, I made a full video about that, and I'll leave that video linked down below. So now let's get into the computer, and I'm going to show you how to use NRAW in Davinci Resolve. All right, so here we are inside of Davinci Resolve, and I have a NRAW clip pulled in. This is this clip right here. And if we go down to the bottom left here, there is this icon here, and this is what you'll click on to get into the camera RAW settings. So looking down just below that, you can see a couple different options, but most of it, what you see here is grayed out. And that's because the decode using is set to camera metadata. So this is what is recorded when you are recording the NRAW in the camera. So if we change this to clip, then we can change a lot of these settings. You can see you can come in here and change color temperature and all this other stuff. But a lot of the bigger things over here we need to consider are what's going on over here. So when we record in NLOG, which is what we're recording in NRAW, it records in the Rec 2020 color space in terms of the gamut, and in terms of the gamma, it records in NLOG. So there are a lot of different ways that you can handle this data. Before we get onto that, I just want to mention that it's really neat that there is a lens distortion correction here. Now, this is enabled, but also grayed out, so we can't change this. This clip was recorded with the Nikon 24-70 f4. When I tested out the Z8 with the 24-70 f2.8, you could actually toggle this on and off. Also, there is a lens vignetting control here, which you can see it changed that on the image. And this is really cool because this is using the data from the camera and the lens to apply apply that as a RAW setting. So that's really cool. I haven't really seen that in other manufacturers RAW. So what you can do here are a couple different things, and I am not going to do a tutorial on color grading here because there is so many ways to do that. But what you can do here is, for example, if you want to just change the color space from, let's say, Rec 2020 to 709, because most of us edit in 709, you can then come over here to the wheels and you can do a little bit of grading, and you could just grade it that way and adjust the luminance values and grade it however you want because you're in the correct color space. So that's one way you can do this. I'm going to reset this node here, but you can also come back here and you could just switch this to Rec 709 and boom, you have a colored in image. So now you're in the right color space, the right gamma, and applies that properly. You could also leave this in N-Log and Rec 2020, and then you could do color space transforms and multiple nodes and all that kind of stuff. But again, this is beyond the scope of this video, but I just want to show you how you handle the raw footage here. And also, I just want to point out here something else that's really interesting is that in terms of the white balance, you can see it says as shot. So what that is was set to sunny white balance in the camera. And over here, you can see the color temperature is 5210. Now, if I change this to daylight, which is interestingly what I had the camera set to, it says 5500 with a tint of 10. So I just want to point out that little difference there with the white balance. But I just left it as shot because that's what I shot with the camera. The next thing I want to take a look at here is the differences when you're shooting in NRAW and recording in N-Log versus SDR, which is what I was talking about earlier on the video. So this clip on the left here, this one was shot in N-Log, and this one on the right was shot in the SDR, and that's what we're looking at on the left and the right here with these two images side by side. So if we come over to the camera metadata here for the camera raw, this is the one that was shot in N-Log. So looking under camera metadata, you can see Rec 2020, Nikon N-Log. That's standard for N-Log. And for this one, this was the SDR. It was shot in Rec 709, Rec 709. And it's fully colored in, and this is basically what I was showing you before about applying those controls here. So let's change this to clip. And let's change this to the N-Log settings. So Rec 2020 and N-Log. And you can see these look fairly similar. We have a little bit of a difference with the lens vignette, so let's change that. And we'll go over here. We'll just turn the vignette off. So they are looking pretty similar here. And, there's a slight difference here, but it's not very much. And so, for example, we could make this colored in. So we can go to Rec 709, Rec 709 on the N-Log clip. And we can go back to Rec 709, Rec 709 on the SDR clip. And they look fairly similar. But like I said, I would probably recommend that you shoot in N-Log when you're shooting in NRAW. If you are shooting in RAW, I want to mention that there are some features that are unavailable. Active delighting, high ISO noise reduction, diffraction compensation, skin softening, and electronic vibration reduction. That's the stabilization. Also, the digital flicker reduction options are not available. Also want to mention that the HDMI output is 1080p. So either leave the HDMI output to auto in the camera or set it to 1080p. If you choose 4K, it won't display anything over HDMI if you're shooting RAW in the Z6 Mark III. Next, let's talk about the crop factor that's going on in the Z6 Mark III. If you are new to Nikon or just unfamiliar, there's some different terminology that's used in these cameras. FX means full frame and DX means cropped. And usually for a full frame stills camera, the sensors have dimensions of 36 by 24 millimeters, which is in a ratio of 3:2. Now the sensor of the Z6 Mark III is 35.9 by 23.9 millimeters, which essentially is 36 by 24. Now looking at this chart here though, it says that the Z6 III sensor is 35.9 by 20.2, and that's when you are shooting video because it records the full width of the sensor, but it crops the top and the bottom off the sensor to go from 3:2 to 16:9. So a lot of people do get confused about crop factors, so I like to demonstrate how you can figure these out on your own, because then no matter which camera you're using, you can generally figure out what the crop factor is and all the different modes and all that kind of stuff. So in the menu here, if we go, we're in NRAW, and we go to the frame size frame rate. If you look here, this is the 6K full frame FX 6048 by 3402. This is the full sensor readout for shooting RAW. And if we scroll down to the DX mode in, let's say 24 frames per second, we're going to get an image that is 3984 by 2240. So these are the dimensions that you're going to be getting when you, the resolutions you're going to be getting when you are shooting RAW in this camera. And so we can use these to calculate the crop factor. So whenever you're calculating the crop factor of a camera, you want to look at the horizontal resolution. That's the first number, because the vertical resolution can always be determined with the horizontal resolution and the aspect ratio. So you can calculate the crops based on the resolutions or the sensor size. So let's talk about that. So based on the resolution, if we take the width of the full frame readout, which is 6048, and we divide by the width of the crop readout, which is 3984, we get 1.518. So that would be our crop factor based on the resolutions. Now we can also take a look at this chart here, and it says the FX, like we said before, is 35.9 by 20.2, and the DX is approximately 23.7 by 13.3 millimeters. So if we do the sensor width division here of 35.9 divided by 23.7 in the crop mode, we get 1.515. Now, since these dimensions were approximate, probably just from rounding in the measurements of the sensor, but this backs up our earlier calculation. So let's just say that the DX crop mode is around 1.52 times. In addition to the crop modes, there's actually a really fascinating RAW mode in the Z6 Mark III that's actually a full frame RAW mode with a lower resolution. Now, this is very similar to the 4.1K RAW mode in the Nikon Z8, which I've tested out and talked about on this channel. So why is this 4K RAW mode interesting? Well, generally when you have a camera that shoots RAW and you crop in on the sensor, that's what you do to get a lower resolution, because RAW is generally a 1-to-1 readout off the sensor. So what's going on here is we're still getting the full width of the sensor, but we're recording in a lower resolution. So we still get full frame, we still get RAW, but we're having to throw away some information here. But the result of that, like I said, smaller file sizes and a lower resolution. So this is something that I was super curious about with the Z8, which we're going to test out in depth on this camera as well. So let's take a look inside the camera. All right, so now looking into the camera here, we can look under frame size, frame rate, where we were before. This is our main RAW recording mode. This is the 6K 24 full frame, 6048 by 3402. We can record from 24 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. This is a full sensor width readout, and it's going to be a 1-to-1 readout. So we're reading every pixel and we're recording it. Now, scrolling down here, which I skipped over earlier, there are these other full frame modes, which is the modes that I'm interested in talking about. This is the 4K 24 full frame, 4032 by 2268. So this one, we are definitely throwing away some information, but we are still recording the full width, see FX, and we can record this up to 60 frames per second. Now, when you are recording in the 6K high quality NRAW in 24 frames per second, you're recording at 1,490 megabits per second. If you're recording in this 4K high quality NRAW in 24 frames per second, you're recording at 660 megabits per second. So it's just under half, or around 44% of the data instead of recording in that full 6K NRAW. Jumping back into the camera here and scrolling down to the DX mode, which we were talking about earlier. This is the RAW crop mode, and it's 3984 by 2240. We can record this from 24 frames per second up to 120 frames per second. And I believe this is going to be a 1-to-1 readout because of the crop, which is a more traditional approach to cropping in RAW. The other thing to mention here is the video quality, and there are two options for NRAW. You can record in high quality or normal. Now, the normal is going to be half of the bit rate. So for example, the 6K 24p in high quality mode is going to be 1,490 megabits per second. And if you record in normal mode, it's 750 megabits per second. So it's roughly going to be half the bit rate in normal quality than it is in the high quality mode. Next, I just want to mention some of the testing parameters and the grading that I used. So I used my Zeiss Otis 55mm lens for the testing, and I just moved the camera to keep similar framing if I was shooting in crop mode. Now, when you record in N-Log, it records in the Rec 2020 color space. And what I did was, to keep everything the same, is I just used the color space transform to change it from the Rec 2020 gamut to the Rec 709 gamut, but I kept the gamma the same at N-Log. That way I could just do all of the grading by hand to adjust the luminance values, and then I just copied the grade from one to all of the other ones. The reason I did it this way was because if you are recording in non-RAW, you can't use, obviously, the conversions in the RAW tab. So I was able to use the same grading and color space transforms on all of the clips when I was shooting in N-Log. All right, so the first thing I want to look at is the NRAW in the high quality mode against the normal quality mode. So this is in the 6K full frame, and right off the bat, they look pretty similar here. I don't see too much of a difference at all between the two in terms of both the sharpness, the color, all that kind of stuff. I would have to say that these look pretty similar to me in terms of the test charts here. And looking at the dynamic range between the two of them, I don't see too much of a difference here. And the way I do these tests is I expose for the highlights, and then I look into the shadows and see, you know, if there's any difference in the noise, the color, all that kind of stuff. But I really don't notice too much of a difference between these two. Now, like I said before, the high quality is double the bit rate of the normal quality, and this is probably going to be more of an issue when pushing the image in post with heavier color grading. But for most of us, I would probably recommend the normal quality because it's half the bit rate. So of course, your mileage may vary, but I didn't see too much of a difference between the high quality and the normal quality in my testing. All right, next thing I want to compare is the 6K 24 versus the 6K 60. These are the full frame RAW modes, and both of these are read as one-to-one readouts from the sensor, so I don't expect to see too much of a difference. Zooming in here, I don't see any difference in sharpness, and the detail looks the same, as well as the noise. And zooming out, the colors look identical to me, so this is really not a surprise because these are both one-to-one readouts of the sensor. In terms of rolling shutter, both the 6K 24 and 6K 60 had a sensor readout speed of 9.4 milliseconds, which makes sense since, again, they are both one-to-one readouts of the sensor. So overall, what I saw in my testing, I don't see any difference in the 6K RAW at the different frame rates. Next, I want to take a look at that 4K full frame RAW mode, which I was talking about earlier, since it's a bit less than half of the data rate of the 6K full frame RAW mode. And I'll be comparing this, like I said earlier, with the 6K RAW. That's kind of our baseline. Now, I do want to mention that I reached out to Nikon to get some clarification about this because in the Z8, which I've tested and also chatted with them about some of the details, it was interesting how they handled the information going from 6K to 4K. And so they gave some sort of vague language to me, which we can sort of conclude what we want, but basically it's in the full frame RAW modes, including all frame rates up to 60 frames per second. They said that they are resized after all pixels of the sensor are read out. Now, in the Nikon Z8 in the 4K RAW mode, it was oversampled up to 30 frames per second, and then they told me there was some other process above 30 frames per second. So the way I sort of put this all together, because they do use the terminology of oversampling in other modes, that there is some sort of line skipping or pixel binning or some other process going on here to throw away some of the information going from 6K to 4K. So let's take a look and do those comparisons. All right, so here is the 6K 24 versus 4K 24. Pretty similar right off the bat between the two of them. I don't see too much of a difference. Zooming in, the 6K is slightly sharper as expected because we're in a 4K timeline here. I think the grays are a slightly different color here. But zooming out, when I look at the two charts, especially with the background, I do notice a slight difference in the colors of the shadows. In terms of the dynamic range of the 6K 24 versus the 4K 24, they look pretty similar here. I think the highlights look roughly the same if you look out the window. I think the level of noise is about the same, but I can definitely see a difference in the colors, both on my shirt and the wall behind me. I think a lot of this is coming from the type of noise that we're seeing, which I've seen in other tests in the other Nikon cameras as well. Zooming in, I think the detail in the shadows is about the same. Like if you look at my left eye, the chroma noise definitely has a different character in the two modes, and you can see this on my shirt, hat, and the wall behind me. Next, we'll take a look at the higher frame rates in the 4K RAW mode. And here we are comparing the 4K full frame RAW mode to the 6K 24. And this looks very similar to the last comparison with the 6K 24 versus the 4K 24. There's definitely a slight difference in colors. You can see on the gray there and also in the shadows here in the background. So again, these look pretty similar to the last comparisons. Now let's take a look at the different frame rates in the 4K full frame RAW mode. We have 24 frames per second against 60 frames per second. To see if there's any differences depending on the frame rates that we're in. Zooming in here, the detail, sharpness, and noise, and also the colors look very similar between the two different frame rates. And zooming back out, I think these definitely look identical to each other, which is really not a surprise because Nikon did tell me that they handle the 4K RAW mode exactly the same, independent of what frame rate they're in, so that is consistent. And to go along with this, in terms of the rolling shutter and the sensor readout speed, I got 9.4 milliseconds for both the 4K 24 and 4K 60 RAW mode. So what did we learn about the 4K RAW mode? The way the camera handles the image is very different between the 6K RAW mode and the 4K RAW mode. We definitely get less detail when you're shooting the 4K RAW mode, since we're using, in this video here, a 4K timeline, but it also demonstrates that the 4K RAW mode is not oversampled and has slightly different colors and chroma noise than the 6K, but they seem to have similar dynamic range and they have the exact same sensor readout, independent of if you're in the 6K or the 4K mode. And of course, the 4K mode is going to have a lower bit rate, but there are some differences in the way the image looks and in terms of the detail and sharpness. Now let's look at the crop mode, which is that 4K DX Super 35 or APS-C 1.52 times crop. So taking a look here at the 6K full frame 24 versus the 4K crop mode 24, sort of the normal stuff that you'd expect to see here with the full frame versus the Super 35 APS-C. Zooming here, you get less sharpness and more noise with the crop mode, but what I notice here is that the colors look very similar. So this mode, like I said, in the crop mode will be a 1:1 readout of the sensor, so it makes sense that it looks similar to the 6K full frame NRAW. Also a confirmation that whatever method is handling the image with the 4K NRAW, it's definitely different because we're getting consistent results in the 6K full frame 1:1 readout mode and the 4K crop mode 1:1 readout. In terms of rolling shutter and the crop modes in all of the different frame rates, 24, 60, and 120 frames per second, I got 6.2 milliseconds. And this makes sense since all of these crop modes are a 1:1 readout of the sensor because we're in that DX crop mode and recording in RAW. The next thing I want to talk about is the ProRes HQ. And like I mentioned earlier on, if you want a compressed codec that is not RAW and you want to shoot in 422, the ProRes 422 HQ is your only option. Now in the camera here, if we go in and we select the ProRes 422 HQ, there are a couple different options in terms of the frame size and frame rate. So when we come in here, you can see that the higher option is going to be the 5.4K 5376 by 3024. You can only record that up to 30 frames per second. We also have the option of shooting in the 4K or 3840 by 2160, and you can record that from 24 frames per second up to 60 frames per second. I believe both the 4K and the 5.4K modes are oversampled. Nikon did tell me that the H.265 versions of these are, and in the Z8, the H.265 and the ProRes 422 HQ perform very similar here. Also keep in mind that the noise reduction is turned on and you cannot change it. It is baked in when you're recording in the H.265 mode and the ProRes HQ. If you're recording in the ProRes RAW or NRAW, there is no noise reduction turned on in the camera. First up, we'll take a look at our standard 6K full frame RAW against the 5.4K full frame ProRes 422 HQ. Pretty similar, but I noticed a slight difference in the color. There's less of a difference than with the 6K full frame versus the 4K full frame RAW modes. The 6K NRAW is slightly sharper as expected here, and there is a little bit of a difference in the colors, but it's a little bit closer than the previous comparisons. In terms of dynamic range, I think they look pretty similar here. Like I said, there is a slight difference of the colors, but I think overall you're not really getting more dynamic range out of the RAW than you are getting out of the ProRes 422 HQ here. And zooming in, you can see that there's a slight difference of colors, but generally these are pretty similar to each other. Now we'll take a look here at the 6K full frame RAW against the 4K ProRes 422 HQ. And this is similar to the last comparison, but more of a difference here zoomed in with the sharpness, looking at the 4K here on the right. I would expect this to be a little bit closer since this is a 4K timeline and the 4K mode should be oversampled, but you know, I think there is a little bit of a difference there in terms of the detail and sharpness. And lastly, just comparing the 5.4K ProRes HQ with the 4K ProRes HQ, these basically look identical, other than maybe a little bit of a difference in sharpness when you zoom in, as you'd expect, you know, recording at 5.4K versus 4K. But overall, I think these images look very similar in terms of colors and noise and all that sort of stuff. In terms of rolling shutter in the ProRes modes, remember we got 9.4 milliseconds for the 6K 24 and 6K 60 NRAW. We also got 9.4 milliseconds when recording in the 5.4K ProRes 422HQ in 24 frames per second, and also in 4K in the ProRes 422HQ in 24 and 60 frames per second. So no difference in terms of rolling shutter when you're recording in the full frame RAW modes and the full frame ProRes 422HQ. All right, so what are the benefits of shooting in RAW? Well, one of the big benefits is the ability to change the white balance in post non-destructively. And what I mean by that is it literally won't matter what you have the camera set to in terms of white balance, that you can adjust that later in your computer. Now, I'm going to show you here that that is not the case with the Nikon Z6 III when you're shooting in NRAW. And I documented this about the NRAW in the Nikon Z8 as well in a previous video, and I'll leave that video linked down below. So for this test, the way I do this is I record in NRAW and ProRes 422HQ at the sunny white balance setting, and then what I do is I record it at the tungsten white balance setting, and then I adjust them in post to see how close I can get them to the original shoot. So let's take a look. So here's our baseline. We have the 6K RAW on the left and the 5.4K ProRes on the right, using a daylight color light set to sunny white balance in both. And you can see there's actually a color difference between the two of them, which is a little bit interesting. Now here is what happens when I set the white balance to tungsten in both different recording modes. You can see it looks a lot cooler because I'm using that daylight light. And this is when I correct it in post. So I'm correcting it with the RAW tab on the RAW codec and the color slider on the ProRes 422HQ. And you can see that I cannot get them to match each other with those different controls. So there's definitely more of an advantage here for the 6K RAW. And then comparing the 6K RAW with the sunny white balance setting compared with the one that was corrected with the RAW controls, you can still see that I can't quite get it back to where it should be when it was shot with the sunny white balance. So this is not perfect, which makes me think that this RAW isn't like a RAW that you would see in, for example, like a Red camera where you can change the white balance non-destructively in post. But when you are changing the white balance using the RAW controls when shooting in RAW, they don't correct back to where they were, and you don't have as much control as you would get in some of those other RAW codecs. I do have to mention though that, like you saw, the white balance control in post was better with the RAW footage than it was with the ProRes 422HQ. So what are some of the advantages of the RAW over the ProRes? Well, changing the white balance is a little bit more accurate in the RAW over the ProRes. Also, the noise is better, and you can't actually control the noise in the ProRes because it is baked in and you don't have the ability to change that. For most situations, it's best to shoot it without any internal noise reduction and then apply your own noise reduction in post. So that's a big advantage of shooting in RAW over shooting in ProRes. All right, so let's talk about the file sizes on the ProRes, because this is where it gets really interesting, and I really can't recommend the ProRes in a lot of situations. Now, if you are shooting in the ProRes 422HQ in the 4K mode, it is going to be 707 megabits per second. Again, this is in 24 frames per second, which is about half of the high quality 6K RAW mode, which is 1490 megabits per second. And it's very similar to the bitrate of the normal quality 6K RAW mode, which is 750 megabits per second. So I really wouldn't recommend the ProRes 422HQ because the mode I'd recommend would be that 6K RAW in normal quality, and it's about the same bitrate. Now, ProRes 422HQ in that 5.4K mode will be even higher. I'd estimate it to be around 1300 megabits per second, which is really close to the 6K RAW if you're shooting in high quality mode. And if you're curious about these bit rates, you can go look up the white paper for Apple ProRes, and you have to sort of interpolate between the 5K and the 6K, but I estimate it to be about 1300 megabits per second in the 5.4K mode. So if you want a compressed 10-bit 422 codec, then the ProRes 422HQ is really your only option, because the other compressed codec, the H.265 10-bit, is 420. But based on what I saw in the test and also looking at the bit rates, I'd probably just skip the ProRes 422HQ and just use the RAW formats. More specifically, the 6K normal quality mode would be my personal pick. So what are my takeaways? 6K RAW is the best quality you can get out of this camera. I think that's kind of a no-brainer. You probably just assume that. I would avoid that 4K full frame 24 frames per second mode or up to 60 frames per second. They all kind of look the same because I think you get a little bit difference of a color, but your mileage may vary. Do some experimentation. But as I said, because of the file sizes with the 6K full frame normal quality mode, and there's a lot of different things to choose from, that's the one I'd recommend. If you want a compressed codec, you shoot the H.265 10-bit, but it's 420. If you want 12-bit and the best image quality, of course, shoot that 6K RAW high quality mode, but like I keep saying, my pick would personally be the 6K RAW normal quality. All right, so here are my closing thoughts. There are a few things that I would like to see fixed in this camera, and I think a lot of them, but probably not all of them, can be taken care of via firmware. Like I was saying earlier, I would like to see a more usable compressed 10-bit 422 codec like we get in a lot of other mirrorless cameras. They could either add more flavors of ProRes like ProRes 422 or ProRes LT, and not just give us the ProRes 422 HQ option, which the file sizes are much larger. I would really like to see an H.265 10-bit 422 option, as this is pretty standard nowadays, and frankly, it's what most of us are shooting in because we get a really good high quality image with a very low bit rate because we can save a lot of data storage and all that kind of stuff. So that's what I'd like to see put in all these Nikon cameras. I'd also like to see the RAW behave more like RAW when changing the white balance. Like I was saying earlier, one of the biggest benefits, especially for me personally, is being able to change the white balance non-destructively in post when you're shooting in RAW. That's not the case with the RAW that's in the Z6 Mark III. The sensor in the Z6 III is pretty powerful in terms of readout speeds. We were getting great sensor readout speeds with that partially stacked sensor, and the colors in the 6K RAW image is fantastic. I included a bunch of samples in my first impressions video, and I'll leave that video linked down below. But I've previously tested the dynamic range of the Z6 Mark III in another video, and it's a little bit on the low side. Nikon needs to iron out some of these issues, and this camera will be even better, but I think this camera is pretty competitive for a lot of the other stuff on the market. Hopefully you enjoyed this breakdown and deep dive into Nikon's NRAW. Big thanks to B&H. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.